for the time being. Long before I understood what Hegel meant by a highway of despair, or knew or cared who he was, far down inside somewhere, I understood that most of those tobacco-spitting, quick-to-be enraged TV cowboys and gangsters would all one day be dead. Not just pretending, but gone, buried, done with. That my always obsessed with a success father and radiantly devoted mother, and forever praying to a God ignorant of her grandma, along with everyone downstairs and us kids up in the balcony every Saturday morning, would one day be nowhere to be found, along with everyone in Mr. Bynes' big red bus and the never-smiling blue-rinse cashier at Freddy's Ice Cream, and just about every squeaky clean brassiere and raincoat trying-on customer in Sibley's department store, and even the sour fluorescents we all sat under at school would one day become part of Hegel's arcane highway, stretching all the way to this August Sunday morning in which my wife and two sons are happily asleep upstairs, while I'm sitting here in my study, watching these curious filaments of thought filter through the dusty pink light for the time being.
Philip Shultz is the author of 9 poetry collections, including the Pulitzer Prize-winning Failure, published in 2007. The founder and director of the Writer Studio, he's been teaching creative writing since 1971. He lives in East Hampton, New York. His newest poetry collection, now out with Norton, is Enormous Mourning, a series of lyric meditations on aging and hearing the voices of the past, while recognizing that in living in the moment itself is of great value, even in a human world that tears itself apart. Back on episode 560 of this podcast, Rachael Tillman and I discussed Philip's memoir, The Comforts of the Abyss, The Art of Persona Writing, which was an extraordinary conversation, if I do say so myself, about how to find the freedom and the focus to write. I learned a lot from reading The Comforts of the Abyss. I hope to keep learning from Philip Shultz today. Philip, thank you so much for being on the show, and congrats about Enormous Mourning.
Well, thank you very much. And I did enjoy. I listened to the interview about the Comforts of the Abyss, and it was very gratifying.
Oh, it's terrifying to know that you listened. The conversation meanders, which is the nature of this show.
Right.
But hopefully, when we weren't extrapolating from your book to everything else but the book, hopefully those parts felt like we were simpatico. So here's a basic question. In The Comforts of the Abyss, you talk about the critical shitbird that likes to live on the shoulder of the writer. How's the shitbird treating you these days?
Well, that's a very good question. I guess I should begin by saying that I had no idea what I was getting into in the writing of this book, especially the long poem at the end, Something and Nothing. On the cover of my first book, Like Wings, was a sketch of Arshile Gorky's The Artist and His Mother, a painting that I became obsessed with when I first opened an art book and saw it in my 20s. And I wrote a poem about it and about Arshile Gorky and that painting. And when I first came to New York, it was published in a good place, and it seemed to get things started. It led to the publication of my first book. And I always thought I wanted to get back to that painting because the Whitney near our place in New York has the painting. And every time I go to New York, I go to the Whitney to see that painting. So I always thought I should do that poem again, go back to that painting again and do another poem. And for whatever reason, in every other book, I didn't do it, and I didn't know why. And I thought this time I should. And my attempt um, led to my understanding that, of course, it's obvious, it should have been obvious that he's obsessed with his mother, and that's why he did this painting. And I always wanted to deal with mine, and I never could be conscious of it. And when I started to do that, it wasn't easy. The shitbird is this bird on your shoulder who comes up with 101 reasons every time you want to write not to. And there's always one or two meager reasons to do it. And they have to be in conflict with the shitbird. And the shitbird never allowed me, after all these years, to understand why I wanted to go back to that painting. And that when I did, the poem came rather freely, although with no little amount of anxiety. And even after the book is coming out, I'm suffering it now too.
Well, that long poem clearly, I want to say this book has a lot of light moments, despite touching on a lot of potentially dark subjects, which feels like the most natural thing in the world to me. I don't know. I'm a Gen Xer, so if anything's too cheerful, I worry someone is selling me something. The final poem, right, it's, a spectacular culmination of this book. And yeah, I definitely feel there is a shift in tone, and right, sticking with the one subject for so long through, and it's a wonderfully organized poem. It's not just some long, highway for us to get lost on, or, I don't know, the nervous person in me that, okay, how long is this chapter going to be? How long is this? It's like, turns out you could actually apply all those neurotic rules to poetry as well. And that seems to be something you've thought of. So it's an extraordinary poem. And, as I become older, I'm freaked out at how many elegies I've written. Like, I don't feel like I'm old enough to have written as many as I've written, because, like, okay, friends die, relatives die. I don't have to write a poem about it. That is to say, there's no poetry police, like knocking on the door going, okay, where is your assignment? Right? Nobody outside of my brain cares. And then the poem shows up and it's like, okay, damn it. Now I'm in it. I don't necessarily have a wonderful point to make in connection to your poem, other than, you are, after doing this very precarious balancing act between trying to love living in the moment and having your mind and your experience be so flavored by the past, populated by the past. That might be the best word. That there is something extraordinary happening with that last poem.
I became obsessed with sacrifice. With the Gorky painting, he and his two sisters, his one sister and two half-sisters, were on the death march of the Armenian genocide. And his mother starved to death, feeding what little food she could procure to her children and to him. And she, years later, died in his arms. And at the age of 15, when he managed to come to America, he became a painter by taking this photograph of him and his mother when he was 8 years old and turning it into that painting. It took him 10 years. And he obviously, in dealing with this, was holding on to her and dealing with the great loss and the sacrifice and the guilt. And at the end of that painting, he couldn't finish the hands, he couldn't finish her apron. And without knowing it, he had created abstract expressionism. Pollock and de Kooning both gave him credit for that. He just couldn't finish it for obvious reasons. He couldn't let go of her. And when I first saw that painting, I was at an artist's retreat. I opened a book and I couldn't stop staring at it. And I realized that it wasn't a conscious thought until I started dealing with it now, that my mother's sacrifices, it wasn't the Armenian death march, but it was pretty profound for me, was something that I could never deal with and wanted to. Unconsciously, I got myself into this poem, and here was all this revelation unfolding. And this is why I was so obsessed with that painting. And now I was dealing with it, like it or not. And yes, it was expensive emotionally, but extremely satisfying. And there's a relationship that I talk about in the Comforts book, a relationship between satisfaction and guilt. And the shitbird is the referee, the monitor of that. It's a violent soccer game or prize fight. And it's interesting. If I can go on, how I got into that poem is kind of weird. I started writing a poem with probably the worst title, the most abstract worst title I ever came up with, which I couldn't let go of. It was called The Real, the Illusory, and the Sublime. I had no idea what I was trying to say or what that meant. And people would laugh, and people I would show my poem to and say, drop the title, but I couldn't. And it was a 2-page poem, and I wrote 976 drafts of it over a period of, I would say, probably 2 years. And I couldn't let it go. And one day in a dream, I woke up and became interested in 2 lines on the second page that mentioned my mother. And I decided, without asking myself, because I didn't want to get into an argument, to take the 2 lines and make a poem out of it. And that became the 25-page poem of Something and Nothing. Isn't that weird how we operate? The whole 976 drafts was about discovering the value of those 2 lines. And I threw everything else away gladly. We're mysteries. We're ongoing mysteries, whether we like it or not. And most of the time, we don't like it.
We would like a little more
reason.
Reason. So Spalding Gray did a monologue about a house he bought in the Catskills. And he finds out, no, everything is wrong with the house that he bought. And, eventually he finds out, the foundation's on clay. And he's trying to ask, okay, how do we fix the foundation? And every explanation was worse. And at one point he just said, is there no way we could have a little permanence here? And partly it's the frustration with the house, and partly it's us.
Yeah. Our foundation.
Our foundation. You quote a lot of philosophers in the poems in Enormous Mourning. I wonder, is this the nature of a recent inquiry, reading a lot of philosophy, or are these nuggets of pure truth, as Virginia Woolf might say, that you've collected over the years that just have continued to resonate and end up being things that you're thinking about in these poems?
I was a philosophy minor in college, and I didn't know it at the time, and I think I only discovered it years later while writing a book on my dyslexia, called My Dyslexia, that there was so much confusion, and I hated to read and read so slowly, that there was something about philosophy that made the struggle worthwhile, that it was so satisfying when reading philosophy that it seemed to give the value for effort. And I've often turned amid the chaos of my own mind and emotional turmoil to the clarity of philosophy, or at least certain philosophers. Arthur Schopenhauer, the one I lean on here, I have a novel in verse. That's what the publisher called a book length poem about the Holocaust called The Wherewithal, in which Wittgenstein is the philosopher I used. And we became very chummy. I started calling him Ludwig in the book. And he became a character in there. And he would take my hand when I was lost, and he would lead me through the forest. And philosophy has always done that. Now, the one I use here, and the reason is where I grew up in my grandmother's house, because my father was essentially a freeloader, and after all his failures, we stayed in my mother's house, my grandmother's house, in the inner city of Rochester, New York. And up in the attic, I had a crazy uncle, Jake, and he had the largest collection of girly books. In those days, that meant nudist magazines, Playboys, very tame by today's standards. And also the rarest collection of first books of Yeats and Hemingway and Pound. And it was just, and a book of Schopenhauer's essays. And for whatever reason, several of these books I've carried with me from place to place. And while I was struggling with that 2-page poem, in my confusion and turmoil, I reached a book I hadn't looked at for 30 years, 40 years. And that's Schopenhauer. And my uncle's name was in it. And I started reading the essays, which I had never really done before. I've been carrying the book forever. One of the reasons is my wife, who was a philosophy major in college, always found him so depressing. What is it? One of Schopenhauer's most famous books is called Studies in Cynicism. So there's a lot of negativity there, but I fell in love with it. I love the negativity. I love the uncertainty. I love the clarity. I love the struggle. And he not only is a character in the poem, but he visits me in a dream in one section and asks me what's my fascination for him and his philosophy, which I tremendously enjoy doing. And I spent the first part of my career hiding my confusion and hiding my fear of ignorance. I didn't know I was dyslexic until my son was diagnosed with it in second grade, and I was like 58. So I always worried that I was stupid, held back twice. And even though I guess I always had to prove to myself that I wasn't by being successful. Mm-hmm. And the more successful as a writer I became, the greater my fear of being really stupid also became. It never left. It never stayed behind. And somehow they came together in this poem by going back to a time when my mother's worked I'm an only child. She sacrificed everything after my father's endless business failures. And instead of rewarding her, I was kicked out of school, couldn't learn how to read until the 11th grade. you could imagine the profound disappointment that this created for her. That I ended up in the worst school in Rochester, and where where Jewish kids had to pay their lunch money to be allowed to go to school by the bullies. And anyway,
Your Uncle Jake's collection sounds like my perfect library. So if there's philosophy next to the pornography, you're like, there must be something to this philosophy if you're at the right age.
A lot of people see philosophy as pornographic.
Well, I think
wonderful, isn't it?
They're both looking for the truth. Admittedly, the pornography, it's a rather narrow truth.
Also, in order to go up to the attic, I had to go through Jake's room and his police radio and his tiny room, and it led to the attic. And you never knew when he was a stagehand that opened and closed the curtains at Paramount, and you never knew when he was going to come home. And he was crazy. He was a paranoid schizophrenic. I mean, a shrink told me that. And if he caught me up there, one day he did catch me up there, and I knocked a pile of books over. And somehow I managed to get downstairs alive. But this was, I guess he was my early shitbird. This was my early encounter with the shitbird. Jake. He would sneak me into the Paramount and through the back door so I could see movies. And God forbid I would go out and go to a candy stand or anything, because all the ushers and everyone who hated my uncle, who he screamed at, associated me with him, and they wanted nothing to do with me because they knew he was letting me in.
I wonder if your love of philosophy, the slow read, is connected to the dyslexia in terms of, you said, well, the reward you got for the slow pace and the commitment and focus to reading. But that kind of mimics what philosophy demands of everybody. I feel ambivalent about that myself. And there is a difference, I think, right? Wrestling with philosophers who are not writing in English, and then wrestling with philosophers who are writing in English, which is supposed to be my language. And I still struggle mightily to follow their drift. But I wonder if, just the fact that with philosophy, you can't race forward if you're actually going to process it and experience it.
Well, you're making me think, that's a very good question, that someone like Schopenhauer is psychologically, whether he even knew it or not, struggling with his own great, profound uncertainty and his own sense of cynicism. I mean, think about having the balls to call a major work Studies in Cynicism. I mean, obviously that Amazon won't even pick it up, let alone, that's not going to become a bestseller. Who would go out of their way? The philosophers struggled with what was darkest and most frightening in themselves to try to arrive at some semblance of truth. All the theologians, all of them struggling with their belief, their disbelief. And I guess that was my struggle. And I identified with them. I didn't understand any of this at the time, and I don't think most of them didn't understand that. Camus and Sartre, who came up with absurdism, which is explained pretty much that period of time during lead up between the wars, were putting a title on that whole period of time of where so many human beings slaughtered one another. For what? And we seem to be entering that period now. Another period, another war for what? Distraction from humiliation, from the Epstein things. I deal with also, I'm sure you're going to ask me, but I deal with politics in our present situation. in the long poem also. And that surprised me because I had promised myself, since I always do it to some extent, to give myself a break, and it just poured out. So a little contrast, writing a two-page poem, and 900, almost 1,000 drafts of it, with a 25-page poem that pretty much, I mean, it was a lot of work to finish it and go back, of course, but pretty much wanted to write itself, was waiting to be allowed in, was knocking at the door quietly and unobtrusively, wanting permission to speak. And I ignored it for the past 50 years.
Seems like in writing the poem, once you did start to write it, you needed to find the exact right doorway. It is remarkable how hard we could work, and then unconsciously our brain just goes, no, do it like that, just that way. The correction can seem so simple and yet so transformative.
The paradox there is that on one hand, it was flowing. I seem to have always known what would come next, but the anxiety was also profound. I mean, the anxiety or the shame behind whatever I was feeling, the anger, the love, was what was the reason I had been repressing that as a subject. I had dealt with it in one poem in my first book, and I always wanted, as I said, to go back to it. And now I was, and all the reasons for never being able to return to it all those years were making themselves known as anxiety. And the time surrounding the poem, writing the poem, was fraught, not fun. And the period afterwards, it's subsiding somewhat now, more than somewhat. But the period right after I finished and sent it off and the book was going to accept it and whatever was not fun. Not fun at all. I mean, all the reasons for never going near that material began to speak in several languages I didn't understand.
One of the things I love about this book is that it's not all cynicism. It's not all the angst of trying to live in balance with, the history of your family. I wonder if you might read Enormous Mourning.
Just let me say, also, there was great fun. My father was a comedian, a great comedian, and a storyteller. And there was always a lot of festivity. So it wasn't all dark. I mean, there was things keeping us going. Enormous Mourning. It's an early winter morning, the morning of my 80th year, and I'm walking my Great Pyrenees mix binks through the Cedar Lawn Cemetery, visiting the Grimshaws, Talmadges, and Kings, whose opinions are echoing off their mildewed limestone and slate names. Benny James, in 1706, still wondering if a second windmill on Old Hook Hill will improve the value of his estate. Young William Lamb arguing with old Henry Haddle about the odds for and against going to World War I or debtor's prison. Lucy Rudershaw advising Sally Ann Bennett against wearing a hand-sewn wedding dress. It's not fine or lacy enough. And a Jeffrey Arnold Cobb IV wondering where on Shelter Island to properly bury slaves, while yellow-breasted wobblers caw at us about graves we left untended, blessings squandered. And yes, here I am, older than I ever imagined I'd be, wedged between the living and the dead, singing spoiled prayers, wondering why I still want to reach across all the sorrow and make my father understand that forgiveness isn't absolution or mercy, but the grace that love makes, the only true wealth. And here we all are, children hurrying off to school, holding mother's hands, heads held high, shoulders straight, an enormous morning opening wide its pearly jade wings over everything, beginning again from the beginning.
I love that poem.
That poem also came out of one line from the same poem that the long poem came out of. And I didn't have a name for it. And it's funny how that one poem gave birth to so much of this book. And when the book was accepted, we were all going over possible names. I was thinking of calling it The Artist and His Mother. I mean, that would make sense. And a bunch of other things. And I realized I had a deadline and I had to come up with a title. And I went to my favorite poet, Elizabeth Bishop. And I looked at one of my favorite poems, the last poem in her last book, Geography 3, 5 flights up, 5 flights up. And there was the line, enormous morning, meticulous, beautiful. And once I had the title, I could write the poem.
Maybe one reason why this poem struck me so intensely, and this is going to sound awfully egocentric. Now that I'm aging, I'm middle-aged, and I on occasion take edibles to sleep, I find myself waking up early in the morning. For so much of my life, especially my youth, waking up in the morning felt like some ugly emergency imposed on me every day. And now that I'm kind of waking up when the day seems to be waking up, I just feel like more is possible. That I'm closer to being in a state of grace, even though I'm not working any harder, right? Like I'm working as hard as ever, but right, I'm not forcing this miracle to happen where I wake up and I don't feel exhausted, like this should be the end of the day rather than the start. I feel like, no, this is the start of a day. All right, let me make a little breakfast. Let me spend time with my cat. I will see my wife later when she wakes up. And let me just have like an hour to myself with the world before the business of life fully kicks in. So that could be a superficial reason why I identify with the poem. But yeah, that is something that occurred to me is like 20 years ago, this would have been a fine poem that wouldn't have transformed my consciousness in this way. Or at least that part wouldn't have.
That's a very fine point because there's a kind of self-acceptance here, finally. The grace that love makes, the only true wealth. It's funny how sometimes our best lines or truest seem to come all at once. They just like waiting also to be called upon. That degree of self-acceptance after all the turmoil is quite a gift to oneself. And it sounds like you feel now, after all your hard work for so long, you've earned this moment, this time. And you identify with the poem, that sense of the poem.
The PhD in me, and I hesitate to say this, right? Enormous morning. The word morning is for the time of day, but it's an homonym for mourning the dead. I don't know that that's the driving force of the poem. It's subtext if it's there at all. But as the introductory poem to this collection, I did feel that resonance throughout, that with the right perspective, mourning isn't mostly sadness. Like there's something that happens to mourning where it becomes appreciation, even if it's complicated.
I have always struggled to figure out which poem should begin a book, and I didn't this time. It was one of the last poems I finished, and I knew that once I figured out what the title of the book was, I knew the title of this poem. I don't mean this in a humorous way, but it is, of course. I'm known for naming my books Failure, The God of Loneliness. So when I first told my wife I was thinking of calling a book Enormous Mourning, she said, "Oh no," thinking it was Mour. She said, "You can't." When I told I think my editor had the same response and just burst out laughing. No, you can't call the book Enormous Mourning. Yes, I have many allergies, but that doesn't mean I can call the book that. And it was interesting because, my best known book is My Dyslexia and Failure. Not exactly cheerful titles. And so people think when I tell them, and they can't see it, that it isn't Good Morning, it's the other morning.
Well, I do think of Martin Amos's success. If anyone's read that book, you will realize, oh, that is a deceptive title. So better to be honest in your advertising with the book title. The emphasis is placed on the positive here. The other possibility for mourning, like I said, that's subtext. That's there to feel if we want to feel it, if you have the right temperament. And I realize it's really bad form to interpret someone's work to their face.
No, it's very encouraging, actually. You know something, we have a relationship with ourselves and our work that is somewhat up for grabs. And it's good. It's nice when other human beings join in rummaging around and in that degree of ambiguity. Yes, it's nice. It's not intrusive at all. Writers want that, certainly. We spend our whole lives, as you know, alone in rooms with our thoughts and our feelings. And we want breaks from that, vacations from ourselves, which of course we never really get. As I get older, and I have to I run a school, I'm a director of a school, and I love teaching, I love my students, but there's a lot of work that goes along with it. And, every now and then I have to sit down with a whole bunch of mail and sort through it. What to send to an accountant, what to deal with taxes, whatever, and laundry and, life. And every now and then I hear myself saying, it's endless. And then I hear another voice saying, no, it ends. Nothing is endless. Don't complain.
Well, and that requires imagination, I think. Getting outside of our moment to recognize how big the world is if we're not living in our own egocentric moment.
When there's times like these, when there's an awful lot of turbulence endlessly, we need moments of reprieve, moments of, just self-comfort. And certainly, there's no small amount, if I may say, of satisfaction for having written this book, which feels very different from all the others. Now, others would say I would probably claim that after every book. And the only way I finished this one was by promising myself it's the last one. And my wife tells me I say that every time. There's a wonderful painter whose painting I used for the cover, April Gornick. And we just had dinner the other night, and her husband, the wonderful painter, Eric Fischel, who I have a poem for too in the book. And my wife is a sculptor. And we had dinner the other night, the four of us, and our conversations are always very lively and very interesting. And we always close restaurants down. The staff is giving us the evil eye because they want us to leave, so they go home. But it's so interesting. The other night, it came to me. There I am, surrounded by three artists, visual artists, sculptor, two incredible painters. And wow, what a comfort. I mean, I wanted to be a painter in the beginning. I painted and took classes all through graduate school. I always loved painting. Here I am fixating and obsessing about the Gorky painting. But there's something here, the gift I've given myself to know these people and surround by all this dedication to art. Wow, I got it for the first time. Why I love artists. The closest I can come with words is to create a picture in one's mind.
Mm-hmm.
That's a story. But they're actually making pictures and objects. And I realized, wow, of course I've given this to myself. It's the most nourishing thing in the world.
There's something extraordinary when you find yourself arrested before a work of art in a museum or a gallery, because there's a part of your brain that's thinking, all right, well, it's a big museum. I need to make my circuit. Unless you're spoiled and could just drop in any old time, right? There's a clock in your head and you're like, okay, it's counting down. And then you see one work of art and you're like, okay, no, nope. Everything else has to go away for a while. And I am doing nothing but spending time with this. The Hirshhorn Museum has in its collection this giant velvet luminescent painting of Andy Warhol in space. I'm not sure how I feel about Andy Warhol as an artist. I don't hate him. I don't disrespect him. I'm not exactly sure how grand I should feel, right, about him. But what this artist did with Andy Warhol, I'm like, oh, if that is Andy's essence, this giant luminous spirit in outer space, which doesn't feel wrong, I'm like, that is extraordinary. I couldn't leave, right? I mean, it's a big museum. Like 2 decades later, I go back to DC and I'm like, I got to find that painting. And it turns out their holdings are much larger than the museum space. So it wasn't out. And I was kind of heartbroken. And I found some other artwork, right, to fall in love with along the way. But I didn't get to spend time with my friend Andy Warhol in outer space, which was a deep disappointment. And I will say, right, carrying the arc of Enormous Mourning around with me and getting to write in it, and I was actually inspired to write a poem. And so in the back of the book, like, is one of my poems that I just scribbled down because this was the most reliable paper I had with me. Provided I'm not scribbling over your text, I thought you would not mind and maybe be happy.
No, it's an honor. I love the idea.
This is kind of the equivalent, right, of looking at a work in a museum or a gallery. And it's a different feeling, but it's kind of special. I could be riding the bus and reading one of your poems and kind of fusing with you for the moment and being arrested by a poem. And, you know, trying not to ignore the bus experience completely, but if it's a long ride, reading a poem or two and being absorbed by it is pretty special. And I'm almost grateful, right, that I had the arc and not the finished book. Because if I had the finished book, one, yeah, I wouldn't be writing my own poems in the back. I would find some other way to get that down. But yeah, those are some of my thoughts about graphic art. And I do find other art that I can't do drives me crazy sometimes. Like I get more excited about that than I get excited about writing. And I get plenty excited about writing. There's something about me just not having anywhere near the skill set to begin to ascend that mountain. To me, it makes it kind of glorious.
Wow, that's beautiful. And I love your use of the word arrested. It's such an interesting term. I never thought of it that way. You are arrested by art or writing. It is a kind of an arrest, and all that goes with the term, good and bad.
Yeah, just I've been transformed. I don't know how, but this moment and the next few moments, it's all about this. I was a student at NYU's creative writing program from 2007 to 2010. You ran their program from 1984 to 1988, if my research is correct.
I started it, yes, I started teaching there. I first came to New York in 76, and I somehow managed to get myself a job teaching one writing class there in 78. My first book wasn't published yet. And I would just drop in and try to charm a secretary into giving me an interview with the chairman, and it took a while. But they gave me one class, and no one had taught writing there since, of all people, Elizabeth Bishop, who had left mid-semester not liking the atmosphere. It wasn't exactly welcoming to creative writing. It was very academic, a lot of brilliant academics, and they didn't want in their midst. In fact,
the riffraff of creative writers.
Yes. My first day of teaching there, I found a 7-page single-space letter in my box that I later learned was in everyone's box by a Dunn scholar, pointing out that my being hired meant that within a year or so, the writing was on the wall. We would find creative writing types, quote unquote, emoting through the halls. I had to look up the word emoting because I had never heard it before. And well, that was quite a welcome. And, there were very many, many nice people that I became friends with, but many of those academics in those days were more comfortable with their writers dead, hundreds of years.
Yes.
And they would probably compromise for only dead 50 years or so, but a living one. And that's why Bishop had left. She later explained that to me. But somehow I persisted, and everything that guy said in that 7-page letter turned out to be true. He was a visionary. He was right. Became the largest creative writing program in the country. And there are all those creative types emoting through the halls. A couple of years later.
And can you talk a little bit about the early days of the program? I realize that, right, by the time I got there, I'm sure it was such a different program that it probably won't seem like the clearest through line, but
my first couple of years was teaching one course of poetry, I guess. In my first year, my first book came out. And it did well. It got some notice and awards. So suddenly I was teaching 2 classes, but I wasn't making enough to pay rent. I mean, I had a rent stabilized apartment, but what they were paying me, what was it, $2,500 a class, something like that. And they weren't ready to commit to a whole program. So I had to teach elsewhere. I taught at Columbia in the General Studies program. I taught at the Y. I started my own class. And I also, while I was there, I mean, are you asking for something specific? Am I getting off track now?
I'm just looking for the creation lore and a little bit of flavor.
I had a friend named Ron Sharp who was the editor of the Kenyon Review. And we decided to give a reading. I think I had been teaching there 2 years, and it was still like one writing class. That was it. And we gave a reading and invited all these W.S. Merwin and Galway Cannell and Brodsky and Walcott, people I knew, and it was and the Kenyon Review had published all these people. So it was a glorious reading. It was a memorable reading, and it was going to be originally in the English department lounge, but obviously we're with those writers, Nobel Prize winners. I don't think they were yet, but we had to move to the auditorium, the theater that they had, and the place was packed, and it was glorious. And there was a dinner afterwards that was memorable for many of my colleagues in the English department. I think it brought home the notion like, oh, there is a benefit to this, maybe. Look at these glorious writers and look at how the audience responded. And a couple of those, including Cannell, were invited to teach there. So now we're on our way. I guess the Nyers gave in, and they saw the benefit of it. When I first got there, you had to have 5 or 6 students in a class in order for the class to be held, and some of these people didn't make that. But now with the influx of creative writing students, in the beginning it was an English degree, an MA in English with a concentration in creative writing. So they had to take English classes. So that benefited them, and a truce was made. And it wasn't until a couple of years later that this MA in English with a concentration in writing became an MFA program. Now we're talking about maybe the early 80s. I'm not sure. I don't remember. I was there 11 years. And I got to the point where I had a private class that I loved experimenting with my idea for the school, persona writing, none of which I could do in an academic setting. In the school, I put writers, fiction and poets together, and they benefit one another, and you can't do any of that there. So I left that, and I started my own school in 88. And the writing program went on to flourish and become one of the most successful writing programs in the country. And you went there.
Yeah. 2007 to 2010 for fiction. And to your point, they asked me to teach some undergrad writing classes where I had to have students writing poetry. Now, my first great humanitarian act was I stopped writing poetry around 1995. And I think from like 95 to 07, 08, I hadn't written any poetry. So I'm at NYU studying fiction, unlearning all of the bad academic habits that I've learned. It's one thing to perform an autopsy for literature, and it's another to be an obstetrician. So I'm trying to become a creative writer who wasn't backing into it from an academic way. And I had to have students in this class, the way the curriculum was built, they had to write poems. And I thought, well, I better write a poem. And I wrote an elegy for my father who had just died.
Oh.
Which was like a fool's errand. But my point in writing the poem was, hey, everybody, I'm not trained in the writing of poetry, and not well trained anyway. Long before that, I had taken 2 workshops with Susan Mitchell, the poet. So it's not like I had no training, but not much. I said, look, it's okay to write a bad poem. Look, I'm writing a bad poem. about this really intense thing that just happened. So we all could write bad poems. It's not going to affect your grade. I need to see you trying, right? And I shared it with a poet who was in my program, and there wasn't much cross breeding between the poetry side and the fiction side. And Austin really helped me make it into a better poem. Like, he became my poetry teacher for one day, and it was great. So the idea of, the cross-pollination between fiction and poetry, I think is absolutely crucial.
Well, that's a fascinating story. And why would they ask a fiction writer to teach a poetry class?
Well, it was a creative writing class where I was getting students to write fiction and poetry.
I see.
So it wasn't strictly poetry. That would have been really peculiar.
I see.
But I felt like I better try to write a poem. I figured fiction, okay, I've got good fiction. I could show them that I don't feel like, I don't know, airing my farts in front of my students, or look, I'm an accomplished fiction writer. I've been public. I didn't think that would help. Showing, my weaknesses as a poet, I thought might be helpful for my undergrads. I do kind of recall there was this academic divide between scholarship and what could be done with creative writing. So you went to the Iowa Writers Workshop. I wonder if you could briefly talk about that.
After I graduated, I went to SF State undergraduate, and at least 2 years, and it was the largest creative writing program on the undergraduate level. I don't think there was a graduate. There probably was. I can't remember, but on the undergraduate level, it was the largest program in the country. And it was wonderful. Herb Wilner was my teacher and ran the program, and you can imagine who they would have, the Ginsbergs, all the people passing through teaching a class. And it was wonderful. And I started a reading series, and this was in the 60s. I went there in 63. I started a reading series on Haight Street, the Iandale Cafe, and people like Ginsberg would attend. It thrived. And because there's so many people wanting to, wonderful writers. So when I left that, after I graduated, I went to Iowa. And I went to Iowa as a fiction writer. I wanted to tell stories and novels or whatever. And when I went to Iowa, I saw that all the most interesting teachers for me and students were the poets. And also the poets seemed to be doing the best with the girls. They were publishing their poems, and fiction writers, young fiction, were years away from having a novel, maybe an occasional story or so. So I tried to get into, I went to George Starbuck, who ran the program, and I asked him if I could also take poetry classes. I wasn't going to leave fiction. I just wanted to also. And he laughed. He found it very funny because he said, you know how difficult it was for you to get in as fiction. You know what you had to go through. You had to show work, and it's not easy. And he said, what makes you think we're just going to let you be in the poetry class? And I said, well, if I go home and write some poems and I show you, will you consider that? And he said, of course. He laughed. And I had just come back from Europe, and this was during the Vietnam War, and the only way out was to be in school or to prove you were crazy. And everyone was working so hard in San Francisco to prove they were crazy. No one was achieving that. So I went home and I wrote a poem about a Swedish girl, Ingela, that I had met in Europe, in Geneva, and we traveled around together, and I fell in love. And I hadn't written a poem in a long, long, long time. and it just poured out of me. I started crying, and I realized how much I missed her. We were going to set up shop in Paris, and I got a letter from my draft board letting me know that if within 24 hours I wasn't back in school, because when I left, I applied to Iowa and Columbia and got into both, surprisingly. But here I was in Paris with no intention of going back to graduate school because I had Ingela. What kind of fool would want to be in a writing program if you're in Paris with? But I got this letter. It had been forwarded through a friend. I don't know what kind of friend that was to forward that. It was 5 years in prison, $5,000, or prove that I borrowed money from her and I got on a plane and I went back and I ended up in Iowa. I couldn't deal with New York and Columbia. And I went to Iowa. And when I sat down to write this poem about Ingela, all this gushed out. All of this anxiety, all of this wanting the life that I couldn't have. And he loved it. He loved the poem, and it got around. And suddenly, they put me in a poetry workshop. And suddenly, in all the, they had in all the different workshops, they would have all the different poems posted, not posted, but in files. And suddenly there were all these poems called Roberta, Henrietta. all they saw that I had been successful, especially the women liked this poem. And so suddenly everyone was doing their version of it. I don't know if that's what you were asking, but that was my introduction to being a poet, really. And I kept at it, and I graduated in poetry. And I realized that it allowed me to do what I couldn't do in fiction. And that's to mourn the loss of Ingela.
Well, I love how high stakes that story is.
Yes.
Make this stick or go to jail.
They saved my life, basically, and I saw it. I mean, two kids from my neighborhood that I grew up in both went to Vietnam, and they both were killed. When I was in New York and I landed, I didn't have airfare to Iowa. And I called someone up who couldn't have been more generous, and they paid for the airfare. And they had someone meet me at the airport, and they found a place for me to stay. And I wasn't anybody, and they just did this out of generosity. And they understood what the circumstances were. And if they hadn't done it, and they also over the phone wrote my draft board before I was physically there. Yes.
Growing up when I grew up, life seemed insane. And it was an insanity I was kind of accustomed to. I don't know. I was like 7 or 8, just walking all around my city. I have stuff to do. I'm going to go watch a James Bond movie.
What city? And what city is this?
A city in South Florida called Coral Springs. It's a suburb with no herb really to cling to. But if you think the suburbs are safe, no, the suburbs are not automatically safe. The context for how crazy the 70s seemed to grow up in is, what everybody went through in the 60s and the 70s that I wasn't really aware of. I think nowadays of young people who don't realize the political collapse that we're living in is not normal, or at least hasn't been normal. That, they are living through my worst nightmare for how things could turn out politically in this country, or something very close to the worst case scenario. And I am capable of just hanging out and thinking of, okay, let's think of all the worst case scenarios. I can't blame young people for being filled with anxiety. Hopefully if I tell them, yeah, no, this should not be normal. The insanity you're watching, this is insane. You're not insane for thinking it's insane. I hope that helps. And I think of a lot of the poems in Enormous Mourning where you're trying to keep tabs on the world and be very aware of the world you live in, including the parts that aren't about you necessarily. So I think of what for me I think was a really moving poem, My Neighbor Ed.
I sent a copy of the book to a wonderful friend who had been the editor of an important magazine, and she just opened the book, and she didn't get a chance to really read it yet. But she let me know that particular poem struck her. My Neighbor Ed. I'm getting my watch battery replaced in our hardware store when I ask Mark, their watch guy, about my neighbor Ed, who works here and whose car I haven't seen in his driveway in months. Ed's dead, Mark says. He died 3 months ago. Smoking killed him. Surprised by how aggrieved I am, I stammer about how Ed lived around the corner from me on a small side street for over 20 years, and ask why I didn't see an obit anywhere. Sighing, Mark says, well, Ed was grouchy, and someone has to volunteer to write one. Yes, he complained if anyone parked near his tired house, got angry every time my son skateboarded down his street, and never once said hello when I walked my dog past him. During the pandemic, I tried being nice, smiling and complimenting his new old Jeep, to which he scowled. It's a vehicle, not a car. Yes, his sullenness was as familiar as our mailman, as mysterious as his absence is now. He had a son, I ask, and Mark says yes, but no one here ever saw him, and Ed never said anything about him. The old woman with wild white hair always tending his garden? Was she his wife or mother? My wife believed his wife, I his mother. They weren't related. He took care of her for room and board. When I ask Ed's last name, Mark is silent a long time, and then, shrugging, says, Cobb, I think, which strikes both of us as absurd. Now I'm wondering, as I wander our village, why I'm missing someone I didn't know. Am I mourning the stranger in me, the hidden, secret, unsociable self who refuses to be agreeable and fears the strangers in others? Ed, I'm grateful for the light in your kitchen window behind the plastic, for the gift of knowing someone lived here among the richer, vacant second houses and ominous silence, enjoying as best you could what remained of your brief and nameless journey just around the corner from where I live mine.